Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Geneva. I'm Tony Consul, the head of communications here at IATA. Welcome to this briefing session on the current industry situation with respect to COVID. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Ezgi Gulbas, our senior economist, and Willie Walsh, our director general. For today, we'll have a short presentation from Ezgi on the current state of the industry. Then we'll have a few comments from our director general, Willie Walsh. And after that, as usual, we will throw it open to questions and answers. That will be via the chat function. So as questions come to you, don't hesitate to start typing that into the chat function. Without any further ado, I'll throw it over to Ezgi. Do you want to take us through your presentation?
Thank you, Tony. Good day to everyone. The title of this presentation is One Ocean, Two Shores, and we say that it is time to reconnect. And in this presentation, I will show the reasons behind our view. If we could move to the next slide. Let me first start by showing where we are as of the mid-year. As we know, cargo has been strong since the start of this year with the support of the global economic recovery. And in the first half of the year, overall cargo demand has been 8% higher than pre-crisis levels. And this is the strongest first half performance we have seen since 2017. However, there is a persistent weakness on the passenger side. We have seen some recovery driven by domestic travel, but industrial level travel demand measured by revenue passenger kilometers has been 67% below their pre-crisis levels in the first half of this year. The main problem is on the international side. We saw a very limited recovery in June, but international RPKs are still 81% below their levels prior to the crisis as of June. And in order to have a meaningful recovery at the industry level, international side needs to improve. Easing of travel restrictions is the key to achieve this. And at the beginning of this year, we have been expecting travel restrictions to be eased with the successful vaccine rollout. As you can see in the next slide, there is a progress in vaccination, but there is not much progress in the easing of travel restrictions. The chart on the right of this slide shows the international travel controls globally, and we do not see much difference compared to the beginning of this year. 3 among every 4 countries have strict travel restrictions beyond screening. However, when we look at the chart on the left, the achievement is clear as we started from 0 at the beginning of this year. Blue line shows the progress for the whole world, and the 2 regions that are focus of this presentation, North America and Europe, they are both ahead of the rest of the world. Next slide, please. But despite this successful vaccination rollout on both sides of North Atlantic, connectivity remains limited as governments are very risk-averse. Number of flights between North America and Europe stagnated at low levels over the last 1 year and are 73% below their 2019 levels as of June. If we could move to the next slide. Re-establishing connectivity across North Atlantic is critical for the airline industry. The US and Europe are each other's most important international passenger market. As you can see from the charts in this slide, 1/3 of international revenues for the US market comes from Europe. And for Europe, US makes up 15% of international revenues. Hence, reconnection of US and Europe is crucial for airlines in both sides of the Atlantic. Next slide, please. And we know that there is a pent-up demand for travel between US and Europe. Here you see bookings both made in US and in Europe for future travel. Bookings made in Europe are suppressed as US maintains restrictions and uncertainty for the future remains in place. On the other hand, bookings made in the US jumped with the opening up expectations since May, and restrictions from European side are lifted as expected. This is a positive development, but it is not enough for Europe. As you can see in the next slide, for main summer destinations in Europe, intra-Europe travel is also critical. On the left, you see main European tourism destinations. Revenues coming from intra-Europe have higher than 50% share in total international revenues for top 3 markets, namely Greece, Spain, and Portugal. The chart on the right shows the bookings to these destinations for travel months June, July, and August. We have seen increase in bookings for the travel month July, especially Greece is going ahead of others, reaching 80% of 2019 levels. However, bookings for other markets are 50% or lower than their 2019 levels for the other main markets. Also, the early bookings data for August travel does not show much difference from July for the main tourism markets. If we can move to the next slide. We think that there is a potential for intra-Europe travel recovery to be better. Here in this chart, you see the comparison of bookings made in July in the various states of US and states in Europe. Red dots represents Europe and green dots represents the US. And horizontal axis shows the vaccination levels. As you can see, the divergence in vaccination rollouts between European countries is similar to the divergence between the states of the US, all clustered at the middle of this chart. But when we look at bookings for future travel, bookings in the states of the US is much higher than the countries in Europe. We think that there's similar potential in Europe if better coordination between governments could be achieved. Next slide, please. And as a final slide, I want to show the importance of cash generation for airlines in all regions, but especially in Europe. This chart shows the net and free cash flow generation in the first quarter of this year, which was negative for all regions. From initial second quarter results, we see the improvement in North American carriers. Some of them are turning cash positive, but European carriers are lagging this, and as you can see in this chart, Europe was the weakest performer among all regions in the first quarter. However, going forward, there is a potential for recovery in Europe, but consistent policy is necessary for this. To sum up, restoring the connectivity is critical for both sides of the Atlantic, and we think that it is the time to reconnect. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ezgi. So just a couple of notes. One is we do have the June traffic results for both cargo and passenger. That will be released very shortly if it hasn't already been done so. And the second thing, I guess, would be to note that we've just had an interesting announcement from the UK Department for Transport. So with that as a bit of a background and introduction, I'll throw it over to our Director General, Willie Walsh. We'll have a few comments before we take your questions. Willie, over to you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Ezgi, for your presentation. As you've seen from what Ezgi said, we're really looking at a 3-speed recovery with cargo performing very strongly. It's been a very good first half of the year for cargo, with cargo ton kilometers up 8%, and in June nearly 10%. So leading the way in terms of recovery, demonstrating how critical cargo is to keeping global supply chains moving at the moment. And again, I think you've got to give credit to airlines who've been able to pivot their passenger operations to supply cargo capacity, particularly at a time when cargo traveling by sea has seen significant disruption. We then see domestic markets, as we've talked about before, recovering strongly. The global figures that we've shown you hide the fact that in India, for example, the domestic market is highly regulated at the moment, with the government imposing both capacity and pricing restrictions, which is slowing down the recovery. Without those restrictions, I've no doubt that the domestic position in India would be significantly ahead. The June figures, as Eski said, were also slightly disrupted by some outbreaks in the Chinese, number of Chinese cities, which caused the Chinese government to impose restrictions. But the international travel continues to lag significantly behind, still only about 20% of where we were in 2019. And I think the message is simple. It's clearly not where we expect it to be, particularly in the context of transatlantic. And you've seen the importance of that, as Eski demonstrated in her presentation. But also it's not where we need to be, because there's clear evidence of the success of the vaccine rollout. We're seeing a disconnect now between people who are vaccinated and people going into hospital, excuse me. And we've seen very effective testing positions in place. And the evidence is very clear, as we've demonstrated on a few occasions. The risk associated with international travel is very low, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We've also seen the WHO issue guidelines very similar to what we're suggesting, where they've said vaccination should not be a requirement for international travel. People who are fully vaccinated should not be restricted, and people who haven't been vaccinated can travel with sensible testing regimes in place, which would include rapid antigen, so not just PCR. We are seeing some positives. Canada and Singapore have recently announced the reopening of their borders. In the case of Canada, initially for people traveling from the US who are fully vaccinated from August, and then from early September, people from other international destinations. We've not yet seen measures being introduced for people who haven't been fully vaccinated. And quite honestly, again, based on the data that we have, we believe the risk associated with people who have been vaccinated clearly is demonstrated to be extremely low, but the risk associated with people who haven't been, but have been tested, is very low indeed. And the announcement that Tony referred to in the UK, where people who are vaccinated from Europe or from the US can travel to the UK without restriction, which mirrors the measure that the UK government had announced previously, where people who had been vaccinated in the UK could return to the UK from green and amber countries without restriction. So these are positives, and we've got to take some positive from that, and hopefully that will lead to other governments following the lead that has been set there. There are negatives, however. We've seen a very risk-averse approach being adopted in Australia, where they've now shut down the country again because of an outbreak there. The figures from Australia remain very low. I think the 7-day average per million was just under 6.7, versus the UK today at 482. So there you have it, the UK at 482, 7-day average per million, opening up everything. Australia with an average of less than 7, shutting everything down. So, it doesn't need to be this way. It's clear that the risk is significantly reduced. It was very interesting to look at the UK again, where in the most recent 3 weeks where data is available for international travel, the positivity rate was 0.6%. And that compared to the general positivity rate for people tested in the UK in the same period. So this is between the 10th of June and the 30th of June was 4.08. So for people flying in who were tested, 0.6. For people in the country who were tested, 4%. So you can see here that international travel does not represent a threat to any of the countries based on all of the data we're seeing. And of course, international travel is not just about holidays. It is about connecting people, connecting families, and connecting business. We've seen before that about 60% of people traveling for international travel are traveling for other than holiday purposes. And this is causing great disruption, continues to put jobs at risk, not just in the airline and tourism industry, but in other industries as well. So as we move forward, I think it's important that we reaffirm the need to get back to face-to-face meetings, the need to re-establish direct connectivity, and the need to base decisions on the data and the science, which would give governments very good reason to relax or remove the restrictive measures that they continue to have in place for people who are traveling internationally. Thank you. And back to you now, Tony, for the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Willie. Thank you very much, Ezgi. We have some questions in the queue, so that's great. We'll start to take them in order. The first question is for you, Willie. It says it was a tough first half, but do you get this? Can you give the journalists a sense as to whether the industry seems to be at an inflection point and we're at the start of the recovery, or do you see it in some other position?
No, I think the recovery has definitely started in the second half. You know, there are signs of things improving, restrictions being relaxed or removed, and we've got to take positives from that. Disappointing on the transatlantic. I think we were disappointed, as you know, when the G7, the best that they could do was create a task force, which everybody knows means they just didn't want to face up to taking decisions. And really, what do we want politicians to do? They're there to take decisions. And if they're not prepared to take decisions, well, then, you know, provide the data and the information to people to allow them to take informed decisions, because without question, international travel does not represent a risk to countries, and it doesn't represent a risk to individuals. So I think we are at a point where there's reason to be optimistic in most markets. Disappointing to see some markets continue to hold their restrictive measures. I was looking at what's happening in Chile, for example. It's probably the world leader now in terms of people who have been fully vaccinated at about 64%, and yet they continue to have very restrictive measures in place requiring people to go into isolation on return to Chile, even if they've been vaccinated. So you know, there's plenty of data now to support the relaxation of these measures, and it's encouraging to see an organization like the WHO issue guidelines that are, you know, very much aligned with what we have been saying. And I expect to see further positive news coming out from other countries as we go through the rest of this month and into August.
Okay, thanks very much, Willie. We have a question that's, I guess, a bit of a challenge, asking, are we not worried about fully vaccinated travelers getting infected, as we have seen in other parts of society, like in hospitals? And would this not make it make people unsure if they see this happening, and perhaps be a damper on travel demand? Any thoughts there, Willie?
No, again, there's no zero risk approach. You know, we've been making that clear. The benefit of vaccination is that it provides significant protection against catching the virus. So it's estimated that, you know, on average, about 80% effective. So you still have a risk, and everybody recognizes that. But further, then, if you are infected, so if you're in the 20% that may be infected, haven't been vaccinated, there's a 70% protection against hospitalization. So you can see the net risk today for somebody who's fully vaccinated is so small relative to where we were last year. And remember, last summer, people were prepared to travel internationally when some governments removed their restrictions. So people who are fully vaccinated today are in a position to make an informed decision. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing, because as Eski demonstrated, once the restrictions are removed, there's a very strong demand. People want to travel, and people are prepared to make personal decisions, personal choices as to the degree of risk that they're prepared to take. So, nobody is immune. Vaccination provides a very high level of protection, both from catching the virus, but furthermore, even if you do catch the virus, provides a very high level of protection against hospitalization.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question about the UK announcement today. The questioner asks, how big a boost do you think this will give the industry, particularly with respect to US visitors? And when do you expect the US to follow suit?
So it has to be seen as a positive, but I think it's really just addressing what most people felt was a ridiculous anomaly. Why is it that somebody who has received vaccinations in the UK could travel abroad and return to the UK without restriction, but somebody who had received their vaccination in Europe not travel to the UK without restriction? So I think it just is a common sense approach now, and the same applies to the US. So I'm pleased to see it. I think we have to accept that it is a positive development, but we shouldn't get carried away and think this is something fantastic, because it merely addresses what should have been done when the UK announced that people who had been, I think the original announcement was UK residents vaccinated in the UK could return to the UK without having to isolate from amber listed countries. So it just means equal treatment to people who have received their vaccination in Europe or in the US. And I don't think we should be too worried about there having to be, a mutual response. I think there is time for unilateral action and governments to take measures based on what's right for them without waiting for corresponding or matched reaction from others. But we have seen, for example, many European countries have accepted people who've been vaccinated in Britain being able to travel to their country and return. So, these are just common sense approach, but supported by the data. And that's what's very important. You are at risk of getting this virus if you're at home. You're probably less at risk if you're traveling in an airplane. But the key issue is if you've been vaccinated, you have the opportunity to make an informed decision as to whether you're prepared to travel. And more, we're clearly seeing that people who have been vaccinated are prepared to travel. And indeed, people who have not been vaccinated are comfortable traveling on the basis of them taking the test, both before departure and, if necessary, a test on return. It would be great to avoid the wasted expense of the exorbitant price of testing. But these measures, while necessary during the early stages of this crisis from a health point of view, I think should be reviewed in line with what the WHO has said. And I think there should be greater use of rapid antigen testing for risk management purposes. I don't believe we need to continue with expensive and complex PCR testing when there's quite adequate alternatives available in the market.
Okay, thanks, Willie. Just in light of your response, you talked about the European and the US markets, but do you think it's simply a matter of time before the UK will open up to other vaccinated travelers, for example, from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America?
Well, I see no reason why they shouldn't. If you've been vaccinated and the vaccine has been approved by the WHO, and in many cases they're the same vaccines as are being used and distributed widely in the UK, I question what the logic behind having people who are vaccinated in one country being able to travel and people who have received exactly the same vaccine not being able to travel. So it would be good if this were to happen, but I think it would be sensible, if it were to happen as well. I think the problem we see in Asia at the moment is a very slow recognition of the failure of a zero COVID approach. It's clear, again, I'm not a scientist, but everything I've read and everything I've listened to from the scientists say that we're not going to eliminate this virus. We're going to have to learn to live with it. So it's encouraging to see Singapore, for example, who have tended to be leaders in the Asian market, recognize that a sensible risk-based approach is the way forward, and accept that zero COVID is not an option. So more and more, as we're seeing the vaccines roll out and the scientific evidence supporting the efficacy of the vaccines, I think we should be optimistic about borders reopening.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a question specific to the US. The White House has recently made some statements saying that the travel ban is likely to be in place for some time for Europeans and others in the 212F restriction category. The questioner asks, how confident are you that the AGM that's planned for Boston will take place? And I suppose alongside of that, how confident are you that the US will amend and open up its borders?
Well, we're very confident that the AGM will take place in Boston in October. The plans are fully developed. We've got a great program in place. Really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be an exciting issue and an exciting AGM and World Transport Summit. And I know everybody I've spoken to is looking forward to getting back to meeting face to face and debating these issues in person. The US given some mixed signals. We saw some very encouraging comments coming from the US about the possibility of a change for fully vaccinated people, contradicted a few days later, saying that it's unlikely to change. I think it's fair to say it's under constant review in the US, with different positions being adopted by different parts of the administration. But as more and more countries begin to see the benefit, both economically and the benefit to their people of reopening, I expect to see the US follow suit. I was particularly pleased that Canada, having been so restrictive for so long, having closed their borders in mid-March, announced unilateral reopening of their borders for vaccinated travellers from the US. I think it's from the 7th of August, and from international destinations from I think it's the 9th of September. So we remain optimistic, and we continue to encourage governments to look at the data and to be confident in the success of their vaccine schemes, which clearly have proven to be very successful. Without question, if you're providing benefits to people who have been vaccinated, I think it provides encouragement to others who haven't been vaccinated to get that vaccine and get back to sort of normal ways of operating as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question about the Europe-US market. And the questioner asks, with vaccines being rolled out and demands presumably being there, is the problem simply the opening of borders, or are there other issues that we also need to be cognizant of? For example, what does it take for the industry to restart, or are there other issues around the reopening that we should also be considering?
No, I think, and maybe Ezgi wants to comment on the demand and the likely recovery based on what we've seen before. But if you look at, I think US fully vaccination is around 50%, UK is 55%. I think the UK is probably continuing to move forward at pace, or at a pace that's faster than the US in terms of getting the balance of the population fully vaccinated, and that may be influencing a sort of a difference in approach there. But based on what we've seen before, and based on other markets, and particularly based on activity within the domestic US market, I don't think there's anything that will discourage people from traveling once they have the opportunity to do so. But maybe Eski, you would like to comment?
Yes, I think what you said was all correct, and we have seen in many cases case examples that the demand for international travel is very strong, and for UK and US market particularly, business travel is important. And when we look at airline bookings, there is a pent-up demand for, especially for the business side as well. So the airlines are optimistic about that, but they are waiting for the border restrictions to be lifted.
And maybe just to put it into context, since the, again, based on the data from the UK, the NHS, so since the 25th of February, when the testing started, 75,000 people traveling from the US, or tests for people traveling from the US have been conducted. 378 people tested positive. So you can see that's 0.5%. So there has been quite a bit of travel between the US and the UK, despite the restrictions that have been in place. And without question, once the restrictions are removed, I think we'll see a significant increase in the number of people traveling. But again, the risk associated with this form of travel is extremely low. So, as I said, for the US, it was a positivity rate of 0.5%. And in the most recent 3-week period, the 10th of June to the 30th of June, where the data has been disclosed, it was a positivity rate of 0.3%. And again, as I said earlier, you compare that to the general positivity rate in the UK, which was over 4%, nearly 4.1%. So 0.3 for people traveling for the US, 4.1 for people in the UK. You can see the risk is tiny.
Okay, thank you. We have a question looking ahead a little bit. So beyond the restart to sort of the 3 to 7 year period for the industry, how do you think, what do you think will characterize the period after the recovery?
I think it's going to be a great time for the industry. I think the industry coming out of this will come out with work to do in terms of preparing balance sheets, which I expect them to do as quickly as possible. But I fully expect the period after this to represent a great opportunity for the airline industry. You've seen airlines, undertake restructuring. That probably is more significant than anything they've done in the past. I think you'll see an industry that is much more efficient. The great thing that we've seen through all of this is how people still want to travel. The demand for air transport is not in any way waned. What's preventing people is the restrictions that government have put in place. And more importantly, I think there'll be a greater appreciation and a value attached to air cargo, which has been very significant, not just for airlines in terms of the cash that it's been able to generate, clearly not anywhere close to offsetting the lost contribution from passenger traffic, but very, very important. So I think you'll see greater appreciation both within the industry for what cargo does, but more importantly, I think there should be very much greater appreciation from governments for what air cargo does, because you can imagine what would have happened had airlines not been able to, as I've said before, pivot their business to enable cargo to be transported on passenger aircraft the way we did, with the disruption that we're seeing in the sea freight business. It would have put global supply chains at even greater risk than they have been disrupted through this period. So I think it's going to be an exciting time for the industry, and certainly one that I would love to participate in.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about vaccination status. It seems that countries are using that really as the key to opening or reopening their borders. But are we concerned about areas where vaccination levels are very low, for example, Africa? What is your outlook on those regions, Willie?
Yeah, it's clearly a challenge. I think fully vaccinated globally is at 14%. Eski showed you the percentage of people who have been vaccinated, but if you look at full vaccination, it's clearly less than that. Australia, I think it just reflects the fact that they were pursuing zero COVID, so had a very poor vaccine rollout with only 13% of their population fully vaccinated. New Zealand's at 14%. So you can see, countries that felt that they had defeated this virus are lagging significantly behind. Then there's countries who clearly can't afford or haven't had the ability to access vaccines. So in Africa, we're looking at 2 to 3%. Some very big African economies still only around 1%, and that is a concern, which is clearly why we've said, in line with what WHO has said, vaccination should not be the only way you can travel. I think it's reasonable to believe that people who are fully vaccinated should have greater freedom, shouldn't require testing and shouldn't require isolation, regardless of where they're coming from. But it is critical that, from an equity point of view, that we continue to facilitate people who can't be vaccinated or haven't been able to access vaccination, and therefore put a sensible testing regime. And that's why it's as important that we look at things like rapid antigen, because in many of these countries, they don't have the infrastructure to support PCR testing in the same way as we've been able to do in countries in Europe. So there are measures that can be taken that would be very sensible. Certainly, when you consider that this is about managing risk, these would be very sensible measures that governments could take to facilitate travel from countries that have not been able to access vaccines at the same rate, and also to enable people globally who haven't either been able to access the vaccine or can't be vaccinated to continue to travel internationally.
Okay, thank you. We have a question on cargo. How do you see the cargo market developing over the rest of the year? And is the capacity issue still a big problem?
So I'll comment again. I'll let Ezgi comment. Cargo is great performance in the first half, stronger than we had expected, and I believe that this will continue into the second half. And in fact, I think, as I said, there's reason for us to be optimistic going forward again, because we have almost a unique set of circumstances supporting the cargo industry. There's a pricing advantage for air cargo over sea cargo. We've had disruption in sea cargo. We've had strong demand for air cargo, and we've had all of this lead to good yields. So the profitability from the cargo business and the cash generation has been very healthy in the first half of this year, and I would expect that to continue through to the rest of the year. But maybe Ezgi, you'd have a view on this.
Yeah, as of June, the cargo capacity is 11% lower than pre-crisis levels, and we are seeing some slow improvements as passenger aircraft fleet is coming back. In the following months, we expect the slow recovery to continue, but on the other side, the demand, cargo demand is, as you said, very strong, and the indicators, early indicators like PMI, industrial production, and also the stock levels of companies in the main supply chain are very low. So we think that the recovery in the demand will be much stronger than the capacity recovery. So the yields will be high and demand will continue in that side.
Okay, thank you. We've talked a lot about vaccinated passengers. We have a question about crew and whether or not we see any difficulties in crew being able to be vaccinated. I know we don't have any specific estimates of the number of crew that are vaccinated, but are we seeing those governments prioritizing crew in the vaccination process?
Yes, we are. In many countries, they have prioritized not just crew, but all workers at the airport. And I think, again, it reflects the fact that they've recognized the importance of keeping the air cargo connectivity going, given the disruption that they have seen. So a lot of countries around the world have prioritized vaccinating their crew, identifying them as critical workers. And I think it's only fair, given that they were identified as critical workers during the lockdown phases and expected to continue to work, that they should be prioritized during the vaccination process as well. So I'm not aware of any problems, certainly not been brought to our attention, of countries where crew have not been able to access vaccination, but certainly that's something that we will keep under review as we go forward.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about the disparate regimes that seem to be developing. So we have some countries like the UK announcing that they'll open up to vaccinated passengers, but with PCR testing, other countries accepting antigen, some countries accepting just the vaccination without any testing requirements. Do you see this eventually converging into a global system, or should we be prepared for an industry that's going to have very complicated or potentially very complicated rules for some time to come?
From the industry point of view, the rules aren't complicated. That's why we've developed the IATA Travel Pass and leveraged off the success of our automatic system, because we deal with disparate rules in relation to visa, passport requirements. So this isn't anything new. I think for consumers, it is confusing, and that's something that I think will take time to adapt to. We've seen that with passports. Everybody knows the stories of poor people turning up to take a flight only to discover that they needed 6 months validity on their passport when they thought their passport was in date. So different countries have different regimes. It would be great to believe we would have a single global standard, but we clearly have not seen anything close to that as we've gone through this. And I don't expect us to see that, but the industry will cope, and over time I think our customers will cope. But that's why we are making this data available. So, for example, on the IATA Travel Pass, which was designed for people who are traveling, but it also now will have a facility for people who are thinking of traveling to be able to go into the app and look at the requirements associated with the destination that they want to travel to, and the requirements for their home country as well when they return. So we'll do everything we can to help people, but I think we've been naive to believe that we'll get a single common approach being adopted.
Okay, thank you very much. Willie, earlier you said that with respect to vaccinated passengers, they should be prepared to make personal decisions on the level of risk they're willing to take. We have a questioner who says, well, what about the opposite of that and the societal risk of, for example, unvaccinated passengers traveling and the risk that they may introduce into a country? Is that also an issue of personal choice, or how do you see that fitting into the reopening?
So what I said was people should be given the information to enable them to make personal informed choices, which I think is the same as governments do in other areas as well. I don't believe that we need governments to regulate every decision that we take as individuals. What I would say about unvaccinated people traveling, just to remind you that anybody who's traveling will have been tested before they travel, and in a lot of cases will be tested when they arrive. And the data, based on the UK, which has the most extensive data available to us, is very clear. From the 25th of February to the 30th of June, almost 1.7 million tests were conducted, and of those, 23,000 were positive, just over 1.3, nearly 1.4%. So nearly 99% of people who traveled internationally through that period had no virus and represented no risk. And then you've got to consider, okay, so what is the risk of introducing somebody who may have the virus into a country where the virus is already there? So, let's be clear, as I said, in the UK, the positivity rate in those 3 weeks between the 10th and the 30th of June was over 4%, against a positivity rate of people traveling into the country, which was significantly less than that, less than 0.5%. So, sorry, 0.6%. So when you look at this, what you've got to realize is that the risk is very small and the risk is very manageable. Now, we're not saying let's be totally reckless, But anybody who believes that we're facing the same risk today as we faced 18 months ago, has missed out on what's happened with vaccination, has missed out on what's happened with healthcare systems. Because remember, these restrictions were put in place because of the immediate fear that existed that health systems would be overrun. That fear does not exist. Certainly in most countries, it has significantly abated. So the important thing to recognize here is that international travel does not represent a significant risk. And in many cases, I'm not saying there's zero risk, but in many cases, the risk is very, very small and less than the risk that exists to somebody staying in their home country. What we need here are data-driven decisions, decisions based on the science. The science supports the efficacy of the vaccinations. We can all see for ourselves the effect of the vaccine rollout and the disconnect in countries where you've had high levels of vaccination with people who are going into hospital. There is no zero risk. Again, I go back to what I said. We are in an environment where we are going to have to learn to live with this virus in the same way as we live with other viruses. And, the world needs to adapt to an environment where not just, the regular viruses that we deal with every year, like flu, there will be other viruses, and we just need to adapt in a sensible way, having taken good risk management measures to ensure that the net risk we're dealing with is an acceptable level.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of regional questions. So a few questions on the India to UAE market, and included in those are, what is our prognosis for when that market might reopen? And what are some of the issues that are involved in trying to get traffic between UAE and the subcontinent reestablished?
So India has clearly created a set of rules unique to India, where they have imposed capacity restrictions and prevented Sixth Freedom traffic traveling from India or over hubs into India. These measures may have been appropriate in the early stages of the pandemic when, as I said, we were dealing with an unknown. Were put in place to facilitate repatriation of Indians back to their country to ensure that they weren't stuck abroad. I think the reason may have been sensible initially, but does not exist today. And therefore, we would encourage the Indian government to review the measures they have put in place to reflect the changing nature of the situation and to quickly return to the arrangements that were in place, which were significantly beneficial to consumers in India. India represents a country that has seen its connectivity increase at an incredible rate, both domestic connectivity and international connectivity. All of that is being put at risk by the measures that the Indian government have taken, which, as I said, may have been sensible in the early stages, but are clearly not relevant to what we're seeing today. And therefore, we would encourage the government to reassess their decisions and to re-establish a normal multilateral air service agreement system to enable traffic to start moving again.
Okay, and then we have a few questions in the Latin America region. So the first concerns Latin America in general. So how do we see traffic demand developing in that part of the world? And then specifically on the Brazilian market, which seems to at least have a strong recovery started. And the question is that sustainable, and what needs to happen in order for that to be the case?
Yeah, again, I'll let Ezgi comment on this. The Brazil domestic market, clearly one of the biggest domestic markets, has seen a strong recovery. Not as strong as some of the other big domestic markets, but a good recovery in the Brazilian domestic market. The international travel into Latin America, I think in June, Ezgi was down 69, 70% versus June 2019. So it's still down relative to where we were, but not as much as the general international market, and has shown some improvement in June over July. It was up about 6 points from in June versus May, up about 6 points from May. But other parts of the market in Latin America clearly suffered. I highlighted Chile as an example, where very restrictive measures in place. One area that's been disappointing has been cargo in Latin America, which again has lagged other markets. I think the internal domestic cargo market in Latin America has been poor, and the Latin America-Europe market hasn't shown the same recovery as other markets. I think Latin America to North America has shown some positive figures, but Eski, maybe you're better position to make some specific comments on.
Yes, for Brazil domestic, we follow very closely because it is one of the largest domestic markets. And at the beginning of this year, it was recovering very fast, but we had in 1 month travel restrictions due to the variants. But following that, the restrictions are eased, and we saw a very quick rebound back. As of June, the RPKs in domestic Brazil market are 30% below their pre-crisis levels. And when we look at going forward, the effect, whether there is an effect from the new variants in the bookings, we don't see that. The bookings are similar level for June and July. So we expect Brazil domestic to continue to recover at the same speeds. And from Brazil to as in other Central American, Latin American countries, there is a traffic to US that is recovering. One important thing in Brazil also, the load factors has recovered back to pre-crisis levels, very close to pre-crisis levels at the domestic market. So all of these are encouraging figures for Brazil domestic.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a couple of non-COVID questions to close out today. The first concerns a downgrade of Mexico to Category 2 by the FAA. And the question is, in what way will that impact Mexican aviation, and particularly the recovery from COVID?
It's a great question. I don't think it will have major impact as we're going through this, the rest of this year. It clearly will prevent Mexican carriers for adding additional capacity beyond where they were. But I would expect Mexico to work hard, and in fact, we know they are, to recover their status and address the situation. I think they did face some particular challenges which they were aware of, and I think we're working hard to address. So I think longer term, it's not going to have an impact. I expect the situation to be resolved and Mexico to reestablish its status with the US.
Okay, and then we have a question about oil prices. They've been rising. Do you see a larger fuel bill as a factor that could potentially impact the recovery? And do rising oil prices impact all carriers equally, or are there some regions or certain business models that are impacted more than others?
No, rising oil prices affects everybody. Some airlines, particularly low-cost airlines, fuel would represent a higher percentage of their costs. At an industry level, I think we expect fuel to represent about just under 20% of the cost base of the industry this year. It tends to range around that 20-25%. It's been as high as 33%. I can remember in 2001, fuel was 12% of the industry's cost base. I think in 2008, before the collapse in the oil price late in 2008, it was over 30%. So the industry will adapt to this. The positive I take out of the oil price is that I think it generally reflects strong global economic demand. It's clearly not something the price has not been driven by speculation at the moment. I think the price is one of supply and demand, and believe that the strong demand for oil, which has the price in that $70 to $75 range, reflects a generally positive economic environment, which will support the airline industry as we recover through this crisis. But again, maybe Eski, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I agree with your comments, actually. It's 20% for this year, the fuel bill. The one different thing is normally airlines were hedging before the crisis, but during the crisis in Europe, especially, the hedging ratios are a little bit lower. But as the traffic recovers, it will be compensating the benefits coming from the passenger revenues, I think.
Yeah, and I think Eski is right to highlight hedging because, I think people will look at their hedging policies as a result of what happened during the early phases of this, when clearly airlines were, those who hedge had significant hedging positions in place and never expected, I don't think anybody ever expected that we would see demand fall by over 90%, so that was a unique environment and a new risk that people will need to factor in when they look at their hedging policies going forward. So I don't see the oil price being a factor that will create any distortion in the competition going forward.
Okay, thank you. We've got just a couple minutes before we hit the half-hour mark, and there are a few questions still in the queue, so maybe rapid fire. First question is, should airlines be able to require cabin crew to be vaccinated?
It's a difficult one, and it will depend on the legislation in every country. But what you often see is people joining. It's a feature of their contract, so you can make it a requirement. In other cases, forcing people to be vaccinated is not possible. So I think it'll be something that will be left to individual airlines to decide.
Okay. Second question, what's the prognosis for airfares? Do we see market stimulation with lower airfares, or do you think demand will keep fares, will push fares high?
It's a difficult one because I think there is an issue of the demand recovering faster than the capacity coming back into the market. So it's going to be an interesting one to watch. But in the current environment, airlines don't need pricing to stimulate demand. What they need is government restrictions removed. Once those restrictions are removed, the demand is very strong. So the reason we're seeing demand low where it is today is not because of pricing, it's because of government restrictions. If those restrictions are taken away, demand is coming back very quickly.
And last question, a little bit of a recap of something we covered earlier, but just to be clear, given that the Europe as well as the UK are welcoming US travelers who are vaccinated this side of the Atlantic, what would your message to the US government be?
I think we elect politicians to make tough decisions. I don't think this is a tough decision, to be honest with you. I think the data supports the reopening of borders for international travel with no restrictions for people who have been fully vaccinated and a sensible testing regime for people who haven't. And I would encourage the US government to move quickly to re-establish international links with their country, particularly to Europe.
Great, thank you very much, Willie. Thank you very much, Ezgi. That brings us nicely to the half-hour mark where we're scheduled to end. No more questions in the queue. So with that, I think we'll call this briefing to a conclusion. Thank you to everyone for joining us.